The worst loneliness is not being alone, Dot. It is being surrounded and still feeling unreachable. Dot. It is hearing voices, seeing faces, answering questions, even laughing at the right moments, while something inside you stays untouched by all of it. And after a while, that kind of loneliness becomes more disturbing than silence, because silence does not lie to you. People do. You may know exactly what this feels like. You can spend an entire day around people and still go home with that same heavy emptiness in your chest. Nothing dramatic happened. No one attacked you. No one openly rejected you. But somehow, nothing reached you either. The interactions happened, but they did not land. The words were exchanged, but they did not connect. You were there physically, but psychologically, you were somewhere else. Entirely. This is what makes it so hard to explain. If you tell someone you feel lonely, they assume you mean you have no one. But that is not always the truth. Sometimes you have people around you. Sometimes your phone is not empty. Sometimes you can function, talk, work, show up, and even seem normal. But beneath all of that, there is a distance nobody notices. And that distance starts eating at you, because when you are alone by yourself, at least the pain makes sense. But when you feel alone in the presence of others, your mind starts asking darker questions. What is wrong with me? Why can't I feel what other people seem to feel so easily? Why do conversations leave me more drained than restored? Why does being around people sometimes make me feel even more isolated than being by myself? And the more often this happens, the more dangerous the experience becomes, because you stop trusting connection. You start expecting disappointment before intimacy even has a chance to form. You learn how to participate without opening. You learn how to respond without revealing. You learn how to be socially present while emotionally absent. And after enough repetition, that stops feeling like a phase. It starts feeling like your entire life. But this feeling is not random, and it is not always a sign that you are broken. Sometimes the reason you feel alone around people is brutally simple. You are surrounded by contact, not connection. That distinction changes everything. Contact is easy. Contact is conversation, routine, proximity, shared spaces, polite attention, surface-level warmth. Connection is different. Connection requires psychological contact. It requires being met where you actually live, not where you perform. It requires recognition, not just interaction. Most people do not suffer from a lack of social exposure. They suffer from a lack of resonance. They are seen, but only partially, heard, but only at the safest level, included, but not understood. So what looks from the outside like a connected life can feel from the inside like emotional exile. And the problem gets worse when you begin noticing how much of social life is built on performance. People say what keeps things smooth. They reveal what keeps them acceptable. They bond through roles, habits, convenience, shared distractions. But if you crave something real, something psychologically honest, all of that starts to feel thin. Very quickly, This is why being with people can intensify loneliness. Their presence forces you to feel the distance more clearly. Nietzsche saw this long before modern psychology gave it language. He understood that most human beings do not organize their lives around truth. They organize their lives around comfort, belonging, habit, and survival. They cling to meanings that keep them stable, not meanings that are necessarily real. And because of that, much of social life becomes a shared agreement to avoid the deeper abyss. That is what makes Nietzsche so useful here. He does not treat loneliness like a soft emotional inconvenience. He treats it as the consequence of tension between the individual and the structures around them, between what a person sees and what the crowd can tolerate, between inner reality and collective illusion. For Nietzsche, the crowd is not just a group of people. It is a psychological force. It rewards conformity, rewards simplification, rewards what is easy to digest. The crowd does not want depth if depth disrupts comfort. It does not want hard truth if hard truth ruins belonging. So the more clearly you see, the more difficult belonging becomes. And the more you refuse to lie just to feel included, the more expensive connection becomes. That is not because you are superior. It is because psychological honesty has a social cost. Nietzsche understood that once a person starts seeing through the masks, through the borrowed beliefs, through this rituals people use to avoid themselves, they often lose access to the simple forms of belonging that everyone else takes for granted. In other words, feeling alone around people may not always mean you failed socially. It may mean you can no longer participate in false closeness without feeling the emptiness of it. Asterisk. This is where the pain deepens. Because once you realize that much of what surrounds you feels shallow, you face a brutal dilemma. Either you lower your standards for connection and force yourself to keep participating in interactions that leave you empty, or you become more selective and risk even greater isolation. Neither option feels good. So most people do something in between. They split themselves. They create a social self that can function in ordinary spaces, and a private self that carries everything deeper, darker, more precise. The social self smiles, responds, keeps things manageable. The private self watches, withholds, analyzes, and quietly starves. That split is exhausting. It means that even while you are around others, a large part of you is still alone. Because the version of you that is actually suffering is not the version that entered the room. The real thoughts were edited. The real wounds were covered. The real intensity was compressed into something more acceptable. And after enough time, that compression becomes second nature. You stop asking whether people know you. You assume they do not. You stop expecting depth. You expect maintenance. You stop hoping to be reached. You focus on being functional. This is how emotional isolation becomes invisible. Not because it disappears, but because it becomes disciplined. You become easier to be around and harder to know. And that is one of the darkest psychological traps a person can live in. Everyone thinks you are fine because you learned how to appear manageable. Meanwhile, your inner world is becoming more silent, more crowded, and more cut off every month. The first mechanism is false participation. A lot of people think loneliness disappears when you stay around others. But if the interactions are shallow, performative, or emotionally disconnected, they do the opposite. They force you to witness the gap between external involvement and internal emptiness. You are participating, but you are not arriving. That gap becomes its own form of pain. The second mechanism is self-editing. When you realize that your actual inner life is too heavy, too complex, or too inconvenient for the people around you, you begin trimming yourself down. You say less than you think. You reveal less than you feel. You package your emotional reality into socially acceptable fragments. This helps you survive socially, but it also creates a quiet self-betrayal. The more acceptable you become, the less real you feel. The third mechanism is perceptual overload. Some people can move through social life by ignoring what is inconsistent, shallow, or false. Others cannot. They notice the tension behind the smile, the insecurity behind the confidence, the emptiness behind the performance. They hear what is missing as much as what is spoken. That heightened perception makes superficial connection harder to enjoy because, too much of it feels unreal from the start. The fourth mechanism is value dislocation. Nietzsche believed that when a person begins to question inherited values, they also begin separating from the emotional logic of the group. What others call normal starts feeling hollow. What others call meaningful starts feeling borrowed. What others pursue no longer feels alive to you. This creates a subtler loneliness than rejection. It is not just that people do not understand you. It is that the very world they are emotionally invested in no longer persuades you. The fifth mechanism is mistrust. After enough disappointing connection, your nervous system starts preparing for more of the same. Even when someone seems kind, available, or interested, part of you stays guarded. Not because you want to be difficult, but because your mind has learned that closeness is often partial. It expects to be misunderstood eventually. So you hold back before disappointment can happen again. The sixth mechanism is overconsciousness. This is where loneliness becomes psychologically brutal. You start watching yourself while you speak. You analyze your effect on others in real time. You ask whether you are being too much, too quiet, too intense, too distant. Instead of inhabiting the moment, you monitor it. Instead of relating, you interpret. The mind becomes both actor and observer, and that split destroys spontaneity. Seventh mechanism is emotional fatigue. When connection repeatedly fails to nourish you, being around people stops feeling energizing. It becomes work. You may still want closeness, but your body has begun associating social life with depletion. So you enter interactions already tired, already braced, already half withdrawn. And then you blame yourself for not feeling what you are never truly given. If this pattern continues for too long, it changes you not first. It changes the way you experience your own mind. You become more inward, more analytic, more self-contained. That can look like maturity from the outside, but internally it often feels Like exile, you have thoughts no one hears, reactions no one sees, grief no one names. Second, it changes your identity. You begin to wonder whether you are the problem. Maybe you are too intense. Maybe your standards are unrealistic. Maybe your inner world is just too difficult to share. That uncertainty becomes corrosive because it makes you distrust not only others, but your own perception. Third, it damages intimacy. Even when someone genuine enters your life, you may not know how to receive them. You are so used to being unseen that being truly noticed can feel suspicious. You might test people, withdraw from them, or emotionally leave before they can disappoint you. Pain teaches strange forms of self-protection. Fourth, it can flatten your ambition. Not because you lack ability, but because chronic emotional disconnection drains meaning out of everything. Work feels empty. Achievement feels thin. Even success feels strangely unfelt when your inner life remains untouched. A human being can survive without constant pleasure, but not without some sense of real contact. And finally, it can make you emotionally hard, not stronger in the noble sense, harder in the defensive sense, less trusting, less expressive, less willing to risk sincerity. You may still feel deeply, but you stop exposing that depth. And the tragedy is that the world then mistakes your restraint for peace. But restraint is not peace, and numbness is not wisdom. So what do you do with this? Not the cheap answer, not the motivational answer, the real answer. First, stop assuming that proximity is the same as belonging. It is not. Being around people does not automatically regulate loneliness if the interactions are false, thin, or psychologically barren. You are not unreasonable for needing more than noise. Second, stop interpreting this pain only as dysfunction. Some of it may be wounds. Yes, some of it may be fear. But some of it may also be clarity. Some of it may be the natural consequence of seeing too much falseness to keep calling it intimacy. Nietzsche does not offer comfort here. He offers something harsher and more useful. He forces you to ask whether your loneliness comes from deficiency or from incompatibility with what surrounds you. That question matters, because if your pain comes from constantly trying to fit into spaces that require self-reduction, then the solution is not to become easier to consume. It is to become more precise, more discerning, more honest about where your life is being drained. Third, accept that real connection is rarer than social culture makes it seem. Most people are not living from the deepest part of themselves. Most are surviving through routine, identity, distraction, and mutual performance. That does not make them evil. It makes them limited. But if you keep expecting depth from people committed to surfaces, you will keep calling the result loneliness, when it is actually mismatched. And finally, protect your mind from false belonging. False belonging is seductive because it looks like relief. It lets you feel included for a moment. But the cost is that you must keep editing your soul to stay there. Over time, that is more damaging than solitude. Solitude, at its best, is honest. False belonging is intimate-looking emptiness. If you must, choose the pain that keeps you real. The reason you feel alone, even around people, is not always that no one is there. Sometimes it is that no one is reaching the part of you that is actually alive. Nietzsche understood that once you begin seeing clearly, ordinary belonging becomes unstable. The crowd can offer company. It can offer routine. It can offer distraction. But it cannot always offer truth. And a person who hungers for truth will always feel strange inside environments built on performance doubt. So if you feel lonely in the middle of noise, do not ask only, why am I like this? Ask the more dangerous question, what kind of connection am I surrounded by? Because there is a loneliness that comes from absence, and there is a loneliness that comes from being asked to stay shallow in order to stay included. The first one hurts. The second one hollows you out. And once you understand that difference, you stop begging the wrong spaces to feel like home. You become quieter, more selective. More exact. Not because you gave up on people, but because you finally understood that being surrounded is not the same as being met. And for some minds, that realization is the beginning of a harder life, but also a more honest one.